James, thanks very much for making time to talk to me this morning. James Thornton of Intrepid. An interesting career to move from what you say was a lucrative career in investment banking, and I'm sure it was. You had a conversion in Brazil, wanted to do something more meaningful with your life, and joined Intrepid 16 years ago. Now, what's interesting for me about Intrepid is the way you describe the product. You say it's sustainable experience-rich travel. Sustainable experience-rich travel, and I don't dissent from that. But is that why you joined Intrepid from Brazil 16 years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Harold. I think, unfortunately, a lot of it's the cliche of I had left university, I'd kind of fallen into the first thing I had seen that I was okay at career-wise, which was in the finance industry and investment management, like you said. And investment management seemed fine. It seemed like one of those good corporate jobs a young person who's come out of university should go and do. And I quickly realized 2 or 3 years into doing it. In fact, I probably realized 2 or 3 days into doing it that it wasn't the right thing for me. And fundamentally, I had to find something that I really believed in. And I had really believed in travel. I'd grown up in a household where my father had traveled the world because of work, and I'd spent lots of time hearing stories about different cultures and religions and people, and we'd been lucky. We'd got as a family to go and visit him in some of those places, and it just made me realize that the world was actually a really fantastic, interesting place to go and explore. And I got an opportunity with a travel company called Intrepid. I didn't know too much about them at the time, and it was the opportunity not to be missed. And I thought I'd spend a couple of years selling a product that I thought I believed pretty strongly in at the time. It was predominantly selling trips to Asia, and to be brutally honest, Harold, I thought I'd do it for a couple of years and then go back and get a real corporate job. And if you like, it has to a degree turned into a real corporate job. And I realized that kind of matching my passions and my interests with Intrepid's kind of plans and desires and the leadership that Daryl and Manch, our founders, had put in place, it was really home for me. And it's been home for the last 16 and a bit years, and I hope it'll be home for quite a while longer.
One of the interesting things watching from the outside, James, is the growth of Intrepid over the last 10 years, particularly, and the growth now into a global company. Is that because of your commercial and corporate background, or would that have happened anyway?
I think it would have happened anyway, to be honest, Harold. I mean, Daryl and Manch, the two founders of Intrepid, have led Intrepid incredibly strongly up until the point of me joining the company in the 15 years previously. And they did a fantastic job in that 5-year period where we started to acquire a few businesses. There was the interesting period we had with TUI PLC from 2011 to 2015, where I think Intrepid really grew up as a company in many different ways. And we also realized what was really important to us as an organization. And then, I came in, when did I come in? 2012, or late 2012, as the first non-founding managing director. And I guess, what have I done for Intrepid? It's probably just that kind of focus on consistency of delivering, consistency of results. And I think I've increasingly, as time goes on, it's not something you realized at the time when I started, but it was something I realized as time progressed, is that I think fundamentally now I'm a bit driven by trying to change the traditional commercial business model, which is that the fundamental reason for a company being is to deliver shareholder returns. And actually, if you're going to just deliver good by the world, then you've got to be an NGO. And I'm really quite driven now by this mindset of, well, why can't we deliver shareholder returns but make a difference to the world and try and benefit all stakeholders? Now, that's hard to do, but I think it's a thing that drives me perhaps more than ever in my leadership at Intrepid.
So part of what you're doing is kind of adapting a 19th century model of business development for the 21st century. I mean, Cadbury, Rowntree, Unilever, a lot of those companies started that way, and arguably Unilever is still a leader in some aspects of sustainability all these years later as a major international corporate. So maybe that is the model for the future.
Well, but what I'm hoping to try and prove with Intrepid is that it is the model for the future. So I do want to be commercially successful. I want to deliver better shareholder returns. I want to deliver improvement in terms of the customer experience, which we measure Intrepid through Net Promoter Score, better employee Net Promoter Score, grow our customer numbers. But I also want to make a material difference to the world that hopefully leaves the world in better shape than we started through our activities. Now, it's very hard to do, but I really believe that can we prove that we can be commercially successful and make a material difference? And that's what we're trying to do, and I think is what motivates me. It's not something that we, of course, get right all the time, but over the last 4 or 5 years and lead up to COVID, we had delivered some reasonable commercial results and some good purpose activities too.
We'll come back to COVID in a minute. But one of the things that strikes me is that the success of Intrepid has begun to change the way your sector of travel and tourism is operating more generally, hasn't it? I mean, we've made, in a way, your sector's made the transition from the people who started by running overland tours, many of them actually driving lorries, to a much more modern, if you like, model where you're running socially responsible tours almost all over the world now, and certainly no longer out of the back of a lorry.
In my 16 years, Harold, we've gone from being a niche and very much being a kind of on the side, considered a bit left wing, considered quite alternative in nature. Why on earth would you do those kind of things? Responsible travel manager in 1999. What are you guys on about? Why would you do this? Foundation 2002, the other bits and pieces that we've done over the course of time to increasingly become a business and a genre of travel that I think larger companies are looking at going, how on earth do you do that? Because we recognize that we need to do it, not necessarily just because it might be the right thing to do, but potentially that's what our customers are requiring of us. Certainly our employees are requiring of us. And actually, perhaps there is some mindset here that we can be commercially successful in the same way. So if these guys are doing it and have grown materially in size, and I think we've taken quite significant market shares, not just Intrepid, but our peers too, away from more traditional travel industries, then actually maybe there is something in this, and we need to do this if we're going to be successful moving forward. And that's obviously the hope that we have.
The other element, I suppose, of what you've done is that there will be people who maybe did want to backpack, maybe did want to go in the back of a lorry when they were much younger, but they're getting older and they still want the travel experiences. So they're going to choose to do it a slightly different way, aren't they? And in a way, your market grows naturally almost with an aging population.
I think so, yeah. And look, our customer base has got a bit older over the course of time too. An Intrepid average customer when I joined was 34. Our average customer age at the end of 2019 was 41. So we have seen a slight increase in that customer age over the course of the 16 years. And you're obviously trying to innovate and bring different product types through to the customer. But fundamentally, we're increasingly seeing that there is this psychographic of the socially conscious traveller, and regardless of whether you're 18 or whether you're 80, they increasingly want to travel in a certain way and manner. And for us, half our battle is just getting the awareness of companies like ourselves exist out there. And I know Intrepid is considered more of a leader and a larger player in our space, but if you look at us against the wider global travel industry, we continue to be incredibly small. And so we have to continue to kind of raise awareness that our style of travel exists, the benefits of our style of travel, and why a customer would want to do it.
It's interesting for me that you can't now go into a supermarket in the UK without finding all of the commitments to buying from local farmers, sustainably produced food. You can hardly buy anything but fairly traded coffee. And yet the mainstream industry seems to stand aside from that, not believing that it's happening. I assume they shop in the same supermarkets that I do.
But the thing I always find funniest with the supermarkets, Harold, is the fact that certain sections of the supermarket talk about a health section, or maybe, like a fair trade section. And it's as if to say, hey, everything else we've got in the supermarket is unhealthy and unsustainable. Well, and that's why it always makes me laugh around Intrepid being considered a leader in sustainable travel, because it's this perception that no one else is doing anything. And if you don't start to move this way, certainly my son, who's 9 years old, if we're ever dropping the wrong thing in the wrong bin at the wrong time, he's picking us up. And this is only going to come more and more strongly from customers and not customers, people who want to work for certain companies. So
I often now hear mainstream board directors telling me that their granddaughter or son has explained to them about recycling. And it makes me wonder where they've been all their lives. But it is interesting that pressure is coming through from future generations, and those companies like yours.
Yeah, and I think the mainstream board directors point's interesting, Harold, because these are people that are looking at us going, how do you do this thing? Like, how do you do, like when you look at, I mean, there's lots of box ticking, unfortunately, that goes on in business, be that around representation of different minorities or genders or races on boards. But removing a diversity issue, when you look at skill set issue, people are now being required to say, where and how do I tick this CSR box? Yeah. And I think the mindset of so many mainstream companies is still, it's ticking a box rather than its actual accretive commercial value add. And until these mainstream board directors get in the view that this is a commercial difference, not just to be successful, but actually talk about the biggest threat to your business, because we all think COVID's been the biggest threat to the travel industry. Sorry to break it to everyone, but in 20 years' time, there is a far, far bigger threat coming to the travel industry than COVID.
You're more optimistic than me if you think that's 20 years away. Can we come back to COVID? I was amazed when you wrote that open letter about global vaccine equity. I think to some extent it was certainly a principled thing to do, possibly brave, particularly given that you're in Australia. What motivated you to do that?
Global vaccine equity? Because I think it's the right thing to do. I think, again, there's a bit of a naivety with, ultimately, we're not all safe until everyone is safe, in my opinion. And so the biggest risk to the restart of travel now is not whether a Brit can travel to France or probably go to the US or maybe even to this crazy place called Australia. But the biggest risk is going to be I think is increased variants coming out of places that are not fully vaccinated. And I don't know what the stat is. The stat when we wrote the letter was it was 1% of low-income countries had vaccines. I think it might have gone to 2% of low-income countries have now got access to vaccines. I'm afraid you've got to stop worrying about whether you have your booster shot or not. The key thing as to whether the world will be able to live with COVID properly will be whether we can get full vaccination of the global population. And until we do, we won't all be safe. And so, yeah. And why were we driven to do it? Because Intrepid's a company that takes people to 120 countries in the world. And frankly, we have offices in 25 countries in the world. And we quickly realized that 3 of our countries looked quite nice and good, which was Australia, which was the UK, and it was Canada. But, our team in Peru, or our team in Kenya, or our team in Nepal are finding it incredibly difficult to get access to these vaccines. And we ultimately have to do something about it. And so we're trying to advocate for it. We're trying to set policy around it, and we're trying to raise some awareness around it. And that's what we tried to do.
But the economic side of that is frightening too, isn't it? I mean, I'm, as you may know, I've done a lot of work in the Gambia over the years, and the Gambia, tourism is a really critical part of their national economy. Without it, they have very little foreign exchange earnings. And yet, with COVID, they've been closed. So that's cut off a massive chunk of their foreign exchange earnings as a country. Luckily, they don't suffer from drought and things grow, and you maybe have a lower standard of living, but at least you don't starve. That's not been the case in other places, of course. So I worry very much, and it links with the carbon question, which I want to come on to. How do you see the future of travel and tourism to some of the small island developing states, the landlocked countries, the least developed countries, if we don't crack the carbon problem, particularly in aviation?
Well, we won't be able to go to these places because there won't be destinations to actually show of people. I mean, populations will be devastated, income will be lost, and the kind of natural environment that we preserve and see before us now will not be available to people. So, unless we are able to take action on the carbon issue, then we just won't have the resource that we previously had at our disposal. And that's why we have to move beyond this short-term model of, the next 6 months results or the next year's results. We've got to take meaningful action now. And that meaningful action is only going to come if every part of the chain takes action. It can't just be government. It can't just be business. It can't just be consumers. Absolutely every one of us has a role to play in making that happen. But business is going to have to keep being at the forefront of leading the way, but prove that it doesn't come at necessarily a commercial expense. Like I've kind of said before, Intrepid, we've done okay in taking some action on some things, but it actually makes business sense for us to do it. And frankly, if we don't do it, we won't have a business to operate.
So it's part of an argument for saying that business needs to take a more than next quarter's results perspective on the way it operates, that it needs to take a long-term view of the prosperity of its business as well as the impacts it has around the world.
But that's kind of part of the responsibility of a CEO. It's a responsibility of a board of directors. And you're always trying to balance those stakeholder needs between short-term delivery of results and short-term management. And I think, to be honest, one of the good things that Intrepid has learned over the course of the journey is hopefully that way of trying to deliver some short-term results and continue to make progress as a company, but also try and do things that look to the medium to longer term horizon that will enable us to have a license to operate in the medium to long term. Because if you just go one way or the other, if we go too medium to long term focused and don't run a business in the short term, potentially we won't be around to be able to do it. And if we're too short term focused, well, we certainly won't have a license to operate in the medium to long term. So it is a balance between those things, but that's where you have that role and responsibility to do it. And it's why we're doing things like, we look ahead and we try and do something that's going to improve Intrepid in the purpose space in a 1 year view. But then we're also looking ahead to say, well, 2030 or 2035, what do we have to do in the kind of more medium to long term view? And that's why we've moved into these, verified science-based carbon reduction targets as an example, because frankly, the only thing that is going to set us up is if every business tries to actively decarbonize and reduce the amount of carbon they're putting into the atmosphere. And verified science-based targets to me seemed a logical way to go about doing that process.
I assume that you're as frustrated as I am by the slow pace of change in the aviation industry.
Of course. I mean, it's very frustrating. It does feel like government has a bigger role to play when it comes to aviation. Little tour operators like Intrepid, we kind of jump up and down and make a lot of noise, and we think what we're doing is the right thing to be doing, recognizing we don't always get it right. But government really does have a role to play. There was the kind of example that I seem to roll out every time I talk to anyone, the Air France example, when they're doing the bailout last year, of the requirement around Air France and the way in which they're going to have a license to operate going forward. Got to be seeing more of these initiatives put forward, because frankly, we're just not going to be in the position we're going to need to be in if we don't see greater government action when it comes to the way in which airlines are put forward.
Thanks, James. Can I maybe move us on to another area, which is the notion of inclusive growth, which is currently very popular in the UN system. It's interesting how the language changes. It was all about poverty, and now it's about inclusive growth. It's all about the same thing. It's all about trying to make sure that local communities benefit from tourism, and too often in the past they haven't. How do you see that from Intrepid's perspective?
Well, from Intrepid's perspective, I mean, inclusive growth or distribution of income from the rich to the poor, whatever way you want to kind of scale it or call it, it's what Intrepid's done for the course of the last 32 years to a degree, in the way in which we've gone about operating our trips. So for us, it's about, I am really worried that people are going to have real short-term memories and think about, over the course of the last 18 months, we've been devastated, we haven't been able to travel. There's been lots of slogans about build back better. But frankly, the minute a destination opens, people are going to go back to doing exactly what they used to be doing, because either it makes commercial sense for the business because they need to get the returns to cover the losses that they've had previously. It makes sense from a destination because they're looking to kind of increase their tourism numbers again. And we're going to be very quickly back to the miserable days of seeing, cruise ships stacked up in canals around Venice and the Caribbean, and tourists getting off and buying ice creams and nothing else, and sewage being dumped in the ocean. So I am pretty concerned that we are potentially going to head back to the miserable days of where we were previously. And we've got to, from an Intrepid perspective, I suppose what we're trying to do is just share as many stories as we can and try and advocate certain elements of work that we're doing to try and show that hopefully you can build back in a more sustainable, equitable fashion, recognizing that there are companies that have just lost so much money over the course of time. And of course, every company has to try and exist to make some form of commercial return, but that shouldn't be at the sacrifice of the communities or environment within which we're operating.
I guess one of the questions that raises, James, is what, in your view, is the relationship between, you talk about it on your website as balancing profit and purpose. The other element to this really is yield, isn't it? It does seem to me that the travel and tourism industry has been obsessed with volume of bookings or guest nights or whatever, rather than looking at yield, whether that's the yield for the business or yield for the local community. But the way in which you reduce poverty in destinations is to make sure that the yield for the destination is both larger and more equitably spread in the destination. We don't talk about yield very much in travel and tourism. We talk about numbers in terms of growth.
Well, every travel company is always telling me they're going to have their best year next year. Isn't that always the thing you hear? Is, we're going to have our biggest growth year, or our biggest, growth in customer numbers or the like. Maybe people will be a bit more honest as we return and recognize that there will be a slow recovery. Look, it's got to be sustainable, hasn't it, Harold? I think one of the things, unfortunately, travel's been painted in a bit of a miserable space as we've gone through COVID, not just in terms of the sustainability factor for local communities, but the way in which some companies have chosen to manage their customers. And we've seen some travel companies out there, haven't we, operating on customer cash, and then when the world has imploded, which no one thought would happen, people are unable to return customer deposits accordingly, and as a result the travel industry gets looked at in a rather miserable way. And so 1.5 billion arrivals might be fine, and that might be increasing every year, but if companies are not returning and placing a bit of focus in terms of bottom line delivery for them as a company, but also in terms of the destinations that they're visiting, then frankly, we stand to very quickly get ourselves back into that scenario I said previously of that pre-COVID environment. You had started to see a few things change, hadn't you? Like, I did love the the Amsterdam Tourist Board. It was no longer going to be about welcoming more tourists into the destination. It was going to be about managing the customer experience and the experience of the local people within destination. It comes back to the way in which, if you set the right goals and you set the right targets of people, guess what? Goals and targets tend to drive behavior. And, at Intrepid, when we look at goals and we look at targets, I know if I set, just top line customer growth is going to be the number one target, guess what? Our team will probably deliver it, because the team's quite good at delivering numbers like that. But if you don't run a balanced scorecard of, and by the way, we're also going to be reducing our carbon output by X percentage in line with reducing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, it does change the behavior and the way in which you go about thinking it. And, a company like Intrepid at the moment, short and medium and long-term goals and the challenge between the two, we want to get back operating again. We want to get back operating again profitably, but we've also made commitments to reduce our carbon emissions in line with these verified science-based targets. So the way in which we build back is going to have to be done in unison with each other. And that's a dynamic that we have to find the balance of. So, setting the right goals and the right targets is going to be pretty important to that.
One of the things that struck me watching Intrepid through the last couple of years is you placed, inevitably, and also arguably rightly, far more emphasis on domestic tourism. You've looked for exciting travel experiences that people in the major source markets that you operate from can have at home in their own country or close to home, so that it don't necessarily need to fly. Do you think that's going to rebalance your product over time as well? Will there be a legacy from that? Would you
Well, I
offer
think it
more
will need to,
domestic?
Harold. It will need to for us for two reasons. One, because of I think just we're reflecting that actually we had 460,000 customers in 2019, and those customers predominantly on the main part came out of an Australian market, a UK market, or a US market. Now, if you look at all of those markets, US especially, I think 82% of travel expenditure is spent domestically in the US. So you sit there as someone who works in the travel space and thinks, goodness, there's a bit of a product opportunity here, number one. Yeah. Number two, if you really believe what we believe in, that sustainable experience-rich travel, which is what we've coined it, you know, call it what you like, it's about experiences and trying to do it sustainably. We want to kind of grow awareness for that. Well, therefore, we need to play in the space. But thirdly, back to the verified science-based targets, if I'm going to deliver on reducing those scope 1 and scope 2 emissions across the remit of the Intrepid product range, then I'm going to need to offer lower carbon experiences on our trips. And guess what? A great way to get a lower carbon experience is to stay closer to home. And I think, and maybe I'm naive, but if everyone plays a role in what I talked about earlier, customer in terms of where they spend their money in that decision-making framework, business in the sense of how it goes about operating business, and government plays a role too, then I think what you'll find is that there'll be a requirement that yes, people will still travel overseas. I think certainly from Australia, they'll go to Europe, but I think when they go to Europe, they'll be encouraged to go for longer periods of time rather than be going to Europe 3 times, or they're going to Europe, then Latin America, then Africa in a year. But then I think secondly, they'll be traveling more domestically, having more localized experiences. And Intrepid needs to play a part in offering those opportunities. So we see it, one, as an innovative product space, but we also see it as part of our commitments to a less carbon intensive world, that our core customer traveler base has to be able to travel, having our experiences within destination.
We haven't talked about biodiversity, James, which, given that COP15 is just opening, is a little odd perhaps. How do you see the importance of nature and of biodiversity to the products that you offer?
Well, if you think about what are the 3 things that Intrepid offers, one is the nature aspect of it, if you like. The second one is the people, and the third part is, if you like, the those iconic things. And so they're the 3 mix of what we do.
And you put nature first in that?
Sorry?
You put nature first in your list?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't know if one is necessarily more important than the other, but all 3 are there. If you look at a good Intrepid trip, all 3 need to happen in unison. And yes, you can operate if you get 1 or 2 working okay, but if we're not taking serious care of biodiversity and nature, then we're going to have just not be able to provide the level of experience that we currently provide. And on that, back to that goal issue that I talked about, one of the goals, like any company's goal, would be an improvement in Net Promoter Score. Well, if I am not able to offer one aspect of my product, then my Net Promoter Score is going to be detrimented. So for me, outside of carbon reduction, innovation needs to play a role, and awareness of innovation. And I don't know if that will be around fuel and the way in which aircrafts are operated. I don't know if that will be around seaweed farms. We've done a bit of work with seaweed and kind of regeneration down here, but I can't think that so much of what Intrepid does is just a bit around awareness and a bit around storytelling. We work quite strongly with a film called 2040, which essentially promotes a series of innovative solutions that already exist in the market to improve biodiversity. And it's a bit like we're talking about, hopefully, with the platform for change, that these opportunities are already there to improve biodiversity, but there isn't the awareness that they exist. And sometimes I think many of us are brushing our hands saying, well, when something's invented, yes, I'll adopt it. But actually, on the most part, so many inventions are already actually in play, but we just don't quite have the awareness as to know where to go and how to start. And just one last thing I'll add on it, Harold. People often look at a company like Intrepid and they say, well, yeah, but you've been doing it for 32 years and it's too hard for us to start to get to the point you're at. Well, it's absolute rubbish. Every single company just needs to start somewhere in the smallest possible way. Intrepid doesn't know anything about artificial intelligence, but we're trying to learn a little bit all the time, but we're not going to go from where we are today to suddenly become an artificial intelligence expert. So travel companies just need to start doing smaller and smaller bits taking step change, and then over the course of time, they become habits. And that's sort of what I believe in. It's what we try to do in Intrepid, I think.
People often, it's interesting, isn't it? When people talk about business, they often talk about first mover advantage, which always seems to me to be a bit spurious. I mean, obviously, for a company like Intrepid, you did have a degree of first mover advantage, and the founders managed to pull it off. But a lot of those first movers are no longer in business. That's in a way, I think what is more impressive now is that if you just picked up all the good things that businesses are already doing around the world and applied them yourself, you'd have the advantage of all the effort that other people have put in, and you'd be able to change your business really very quickly, applying methods which other people have used and demonstrated work.
And we're not perfect, again, but we've put a few toolkits on our website, and some people may agree with some aspects of those toolkits and might not agree with them, but we've got 32 years experience of operating with them. So just come and take them from us, because we're offering them out there to share them. And you know, some of the best ideas are, as I said, already there, and companies should be taking them from us.
I mean, it's clear, James, that Intrepid will be a major contributor to the platform for change, and I'm grateful for that. But I also suspect that you'll find some things there that you didn't know about that are equally interesting for you. And I think now creating a platform for change that really says to people, look, the other businesses have done this, they're still in business, many of them are prospering. That's how we need to force change in the industry, and my goodness, we need to speed up. I don't share your optimism about 20 years. I think I'm with Joe Biden on this. I think it's a critical decade now, and we've really got to push for all the change we can get in the next 10.
Yeah, look, maybe 20 years is an exaggeration, Harold, and one of the things we've always talked about 2025 and 2030. Well, 2025, was it 3 years away?
Yeah.
You know, what are we, 8 years from 2030? That will come around in a flash. And just go back the other way, 2014 was 8 years ago. So, I mean, that in itself is absolutely alarming. The reality is we've got to take action. Us as consumers, where we're spending our money, us as individuals, where we choose to work, and then us as businesses, how we choose to operate, because otherwise we won't have a license to operate.
And we've got to change the rest of our industry to move with us, because otherwise we'll go down with them. If aviation, for example, it seems to me if aviation fails to adapt and we massively reduce its emissions, there will be rationing of flights, and that will be a disaster, not only for outbound travelers about whom I worry less than I worry about the people in destinations who will lose the foreign exchange earnings, which are so critical to so many developing and underdeveloped countries.
And I sort of feel like Australia, the US, and the UK might pivot okay, because they will operate those domestic experiences. But it's your example of the Gambia earlier, Harold. You know, if we're not able to take action, you know, it's hugely devastating for, in particular, low-income countries.
James, thanks very much for your time. It's been a fascinating interview, and thanks for your support for the Platform for Change. We'll
Thanks, Harold.
be back in touch. Thanks so much indeed.